Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. Can you see me and hear me? All right, that's good. We'll get started momentarily. I'll be right back. Okay, good morning, everyone. Can you see and hear? Still working? Woohoo! Even in sub-zero weather, the technology holds this Sunday morning. Baruch Hashem. Okay, thank you, everybody, for joining. Special thank you to our sponsors this morning, to Mr. and Mrs. Gertz, to Sharon and Seymour and family, in loving memory of Sharon's mother, Mrs. Doris Rosenberg, Aleh HaShalom, Morris Dvorah Esther Basra of David, and to Ruth Rotenberg and Glenn Miller in memory and celebration of the life of their daughter, Taniel, and her commitment to Torah, Maras Taniel Gavriela Margalit, Bas Reb Gadol Moshe, Verus Meira. The Neshamas should have an aliyah. Thank you so much. Tizkul Mitzvos. We're going to utilize our multimedia technological capabilities today with our presentation to focus on today's letter. So to do that, I'm going to invite you, before we get started, to watch the following presentation with me. I hope it's going to work on your end. Bevakasha.
The story of the Rebbe's life parallels the story of Judaism in the 20th century. He was born in Tsarist Russia at the turn of the century, a descendant of the first Rebbes of Chabad. He survived the murderous pogroms that swept through Tsarist Russia in the early 1900s. As the communist revolution began to take root and power was seized by the Bolsheviks, he watched his parents walk the halls of power, fighting for the rights of Jews and Judaism. As a teenager during World War I, his home was a center of relief efforts for the tens of thousands of Jewish refugees who flooded their city. In his 20s, he met and studied with the Torah giants of his times. He married the daughter of the 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe in a wedding attended by Jewish leaders from far and near. Living in Berlin during Hitler's rise to power, he witnessed firsthand a modern society turning against the Jews within it. He escaped Paris only days ahead of the Nazi advance into the city, then crossed the Atlantic on one of the last civilian vessels to leave warlock Europe. When he arrived, his father-in-law placed him at the helm of Lubavitcher's newly founded educational, social, and publishing departments. As the center of world Jewry shifted to the United States, he became the leader of the Lubavitch Hasidic movement. At the time, his strategy was considered risky, even dangerous. He taught his followers, in addition to focusing inward on improving themselves, to bring Judaism outward, pioneering the concept of modern Jewish outreach. As hundreds of thousands of Jewish pioneers moved to the Holy Land, he engaged and corresponded with their leaders. During peace and conflict, he embraced the people and the land of Israel. In evolving attitudes and trends, he managed to identify a yearning for something higher, endeavoring to quench the thirst with increased spirituality and morality. Under the noses of brutal dictators, he ran a network of clandestine operatives. As Jews began to enjoy a freedom unseen in hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, he proclaimed that moral people must be a light unto their neighbors, promoting the 7 universal laws for all of humanity. In a century which saw more scientific advances than thousands of years before it, he embraced what others shunned, encouraging that technology be used in the service of its creator. As travel and communication made the world smaller, he inspired thousands to reach out to their brethren in love, as they had once been chased down in hatred. The Rebbe spoke precious little about himself, so his life has never been properly documented. Rather, it is impressed on the hearts and minds.
Okay, did the audio work? Okay, Baruch Hashem, great. So this morning, we are going to focus on this individual, the late, great Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha. And we want to focus today on an understanding, or perhaps a takeaway from the Rebbe's life and the Rebbe's teachings and the Rebbe's mission that relates to us, that speaks to us and empowers us to make a difference in our Yiddishkeit and our growth, whether we are Chassidish or not Chassidish, Lubavitch, not Lubavitch. Using this letter, the Rebbe's letter to Ben Gurion, perhaps can give us some insight into this Nakuda, and to help us understand a little bit, maybe to some extent, as an outsider, what made the Rebbe distinct in his approach. How is it possible that he inspired tens of thousands of people to go out and live in the far-flung, the farthest reaches of humanity, not just the Jewish world, to inspire so many shluchim, tens of thousands of people and movements, and so many people who became close to Yiddishkeit through the Rebbe's influence? Where does that come from? So obviously there are so many things, and for those who are interested, in the last couple of years, there were some interesting books that were published about the Rebbe. One is by Rabbi Telushkin, a few other ones, very interesting, wonderful, and inspiring books. But today, by studying the Rebbe's letter to Ben Gurion, we can hone in on perhaps one aspect which we can apply in our lives. So if you have the email from early this morning, I sent out the Rebbe's letter with the English translation. Well, let me share it on the screen now. Let's see, hold on. Okay. Okay. Can you see it there? I can't see you yet. Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay. So let's get straight to it. This letter you see is written Ches Adar Aleph Taf Shin Yud Tes, meaning it's February 1959. The Rebbe has been the spiritual leader of Chabad Lubavitch since 1951. His father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, passed away in 1950. The Rebbe becomes the leader of Chabad when he said over this Maimer in 1951, with the introductory video, which hopefully you saw on the screen. That was the launching of the Rebbe, so to speak, career. So now the Rebbe is 7 years, 8 years, right, 9 years, just the first decade of his Tkufa of the Nesius. And he's writing from Brooklyn, New York. Ches Adar. L'chvod Mar Dalid Ben Gurion Sheyichye Rosh HaMemshala. So he says, let's answer your letter. And what I'd like to point out here is that what we're going to focus on is not just or primarily the Rebbe's answer, but the addendum of this letter. So if you saw the letter in advance, or if you take a look at it later, you'll see there are two letters here. So we're going to first go through the first one very quickly. He says, regarding your letter, you asked my opinion regarding the registration of intermarried parents, how they can register their children. Daiti Brua Behechlet, second paragraph here on the screen. My opinion is unequivocal regarding in consonance with the Torah and the tradition that we have received for generations and generations. In these areas, ein kol tokef, there is no effect lahatzhara bedibur, for a verbal declaration al haratzon, on the wish lihirashem betor Yehudi, to be signed up as a Jew. Ve'ein b'koach hatzara zu l'shanas hametzias. This cannot change the reality. The reality is, according to the Torah third paragraph, if you're following at home, there's also the English, which is in the email in that same scan. Yehudi, second line here, a Jew who zerak ze, if he is nolad, third line, third paragraph, me'im Yehudiya, from a Jewish mother, or Gershin is Gayer, a convert who converted ba'ofen gerus miduyak, with the precise process of conversion. Asher Prite Seder Gerizeh, the details of this are explained in the Piskei Dinim of our generation, from generations all the way until the Shulchan Aruch. And what it says, Ha'omer b'melo tokfo lo rak nogea leyeladim. It's not just for children; it's for anybody who shows up. B'chavod u'b'bracha. Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Great. That's the letter. Now, in the footnote, he deals with a couple of specific items, which you see here on the screen. Everything I'm going to tell you now, the Rebbe says, is not to amplify what I said, in the sense that if you don't agree with what I said until now, if you don't agree with what I'm about to tell you, you can take away what I said until now. No, what I said until now is the end of the story. I'm just adding a few things, which is Aleph. He says, first of all, as you mentioned in your letter, the issue of registering Jews as Jewish is not just limited to Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, it relates to the entirety of the Jewish people, where everybody is. So the danger of fragmenting the Jewish people is very significant. Number two, Beis, this connection to the Jewish people has never been some kind of external formal documentation. That's not what this is about being Jewish. Skimming ahead, down, I got to go back. I told you this scan is out of order. I got to go back down here the way till here. Oh, it's sideways. Okay, you know what? Sharing a screen sideways, that's already not very useful. Unless you're going to stand like this. So I'll just read it out of the book that I have in front of me. Al Regalachas. He says, number 2, making it easier for someone to join the Jewish people. Interesting, this is the Rebbe, and he says to you, this is take it or leave it. Making it easier to join the Jewish people, especially in the situation where we find ourselves right now, that the Jewish state and the nation is surrounded by enemies. He says he's worried that the security of the land of Israel will be compromised if people become Jewish en masse without a rigorous conversion process. Number 4, he says, even if you're going to somehow figure out a way around the technical aspects here, he says, I'm worried about the security. And obviously, point number 5, you can't ask about cases, anomalous cases of somebody who followed the process of Gerus and then didn't have a fealty to the Jewish people, or people who support the Jewish state who are not Jewish. Those are definitely true. And the 6th, the last point here in the footnote is Bazbaras Gidrei Hashela Niskar Gamkin. Okay, unfrozen. And he says, I finish with Tikva Utzipiyah, that Eretz Yisrael will now and continue to be Echad Ya'achedes Kol B'nei Yisrael B'chol Katzvos Tevel, Brooklyn, New York, Tavshin Yutes. Great. Okay, that's the first letter. And so we're done. That's the whole letter. That's today's shir. So far, so good? Okay, so far, so good. But the Rebbe has a second letter. And that's what I really want to focus on. The second letter. The second letter. Now, to introduce this second letter, I'm going to share with you another video clip. So we're going to turn your attention to the screen from someone who was deeply influenced by this individual, by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This is a talk that was given on November 13th, 2011 by the late, great Lord Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. That some of you probably know, Rabbi Sachs was deeply influenced by the Rebbe, and Rabbi Sachs tells the story of how he first came to meet the Rebbe, how in 1967 he traveled to the United States. He shows up in Brooklyn. He comes to 770. He finds a chassan on the street, and he says, I'd like to come and see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And the guy bursts out laughing. He's like, yeah, you and 100,000 other people. So he gives a random chassan, he gives him his telephone number. He says, I'm going to be in Los Angeles at my aunt. If the Rebbe happens to have time, maybe somebody could do me a tova, do me a favor and phone me, he says, to give me a call, and I'll be there. So now turn your attention to the screen for the rest of the story.
It was Chabad, the Rebbe will see you on Thursday. Now I had no money in those days, and all I had was a Greyhound bus ticket. If you ever ridden from Los Angeles to New York on a Greyhound bus, 72 hours non-stop, I sat on this bus, I came to 770, and eventually the moment came when I was ushered into the Rebbe's study. I asked him all my intellectual, philosophical questions. He gave me intellectual, philosophical answers. And then he did what no one else had done. He did a role reversal. He started asking me questions. How many Jewish students in Cambridge? How many get involved in Jewish life? What are you doing to bring other people in? Now, I hadn't come to become a shaliach. I come to ask a few simple questions. And all of a sudden, he was challenging me. So I did the English thing. You know, the English can construct sentences like nobody else, you know? They can construct more complex excuses for doing nothing than anyone else on earth. So I started a sentence, in the situation in which I find myself. And the Rebbe did something which I think was quite unusual for him. He actually stopped me in mid-sentence. He says, nobody finds themselves in a situation. You put yourself in a situation. And if you put yourself in that situation, you can put yourself in another situation. That moment changed my life. Here I was. Here I was, a nobody from nowhere, and here was one of the greatest leaders in the Jewish world challenging me not to accept the situation, but to change it. And that...
Okay, we're going to hold the video here. I will tell you that there's a lot to enjoy about the rest of this talk that Rabbi Sachs gave at this Kinos Shluchim. I'm happy to send you the link on the email or put it in the chat. But this story of Rabbi Sachs about how the Rebbe looked at him and asked him a question is going to be the frame, is going to help us understand something about this letter and something about ourselves and what I'd like us to consider today. So now we go to the second letter. And this to me is the very interesting and unique contribution that the Rebbe makes to our whole series and this discussion of the letters to Ben Gurion. He says, Esmol, he says, L'chvod Mar David Sheyichya Ben Gurion, David Ben Gurion. This letter is entitled the 9th of Adar. It says, yesterday, Esmol, I sent you a formal answer to the question regarding the registration. And after I apologized for the delay in answering your letter, remember, Ben Gurion's letter had been sent to him 2 or 3 months earlier. He says there were many reasons why I was delayed, but he says, I apologize for the delay, but I have to add another letter, a separate letter. And that is Bilti Rishmi, an unofficial letter. What's the Rebbe saying now? He's saying, I don't know if he had a personal relationship, if he ever met Ben Gurion. I don't think so. And I don't think he would call him Dudik or Reb Davidel, but he's leaning into the prime minister and he's saying, Mr. Ben Gurion, Yedidi, my good friend, I'm going to write you a personal letter. Not an official, and he says, not afilu chatzi rishmi, not even half official. And therefore he says, I'm going to ask, tikvasi, my hope, asher yislach li kvodo, you'll accept my apology, al kisvi beli diplomatia, without diplomacy. I'm just speaking to you, the Rebbe says, I'm writing to you personally. And I'm thinking about something that I want to bring to your attention. He says in the third paragraph, he says, since the truth is in our world, kol inyan, every issue, eino mufshati, it is not abstract, but it's concrete. It relates to people, to individuals, to circumstances. And I want to use this opportunity and this circumstance by you inviting me to answer your letter, Lavo b'shurosai de lahalan. I want to address you in these letters, in these words, as betorze, as the person ha'omed barosh ba'yas harishum. You are the one who stands at the helm, at the top of this issue of the registration of the children. But more than that, he says to Ben Gurion, Yosemizeh, shash ba'aso gedola, your influence is great. Bereka hachayim, with the background of life, shaba'artzenu hakdosha. You're an influential person, Ben Gurion. So I'd like to share something with you. I'd like to talk to you. He says, obviously, bevadai she'ein sorech laharich. We don't have to belabor the point, binekuda, she'tkufasenu zui tkufas hadas olam. Beyichud b'chai amenu b'nei Yisrael b'chol makom shehim him b'geshem v'ruach. I don't have to belabor the point, and you know what the truth is, I can put it on the screen now. Hold on. Let me share the screen. This time I'll share it in English. It might be a little bit easier. It'll definitely be easier for you to see, and I won't have to go out of order. Hang on. Here we go. Okay, this is from the Litvin translation. Here we go. Okay, tell me now if you see it on the screen in English. Great. Of course, at a time like this, the responsibility, back up. Yeah, here it is. This is where we were. There is certainly no need to stress that we are living in an historic period, particularly for the Jewish people, both in the material and spiritual sphere. As has always been the case in our history, spiritual matters exert a greater influence on material ones than vice versa. Parentheses. Of course, at a time like this, the responsibility devolving on each individual is immeasurably greater than in normal times. In particular, the responsibility devolving on those who wield unusual influence of considerable proportions in many spheres of Jewish life is possibly much greater than the possessor of that influence imagine. In every case, responsibility involves privilege. The greater one's responsibility, the greater is one's privilege when one lives up to and fulfills such a responsibility. Not everyone is granted such a great and meritorious public responsibility, and not everyone who is granted it finds the hour opportune for the fulfillment of the task and responsibility. I am referring here to your influence. In whatever way the situation may be officially defined, your decision, for all practical purposes, carries decisive weight in the most important fields of public life in Eretz Yisrael, including many matters in the spiritual sphere. I am not concerned here with the question as to whether the form of government is democratic or not, so my purpose is not to debate. And as I have pointed out, my letter is unofficial and only concerns the reality as it is. As I see it, you have the greatest influence on the shaping of the situation in our homeland, whether it be exerted directly or indirectly. It was once fashionable in certain circles to suggest that the Jewish religion and the religious observances were necessary for those living in the diaspora as a shield against assimilation. And the rest of the paragraph, he talks about how this is important, of course, and now in Israel. Next paragraph, I'm skipping. I do not wish to dwell on this painful subject at all for obvious reasons, since I see no further need for further elaborations. One of the reasons is that I fervently hope that this calamity will not come to pass, meaning his worry that the next generation of Jews living in Israel will be divorced from their past and disconnected from the Masorah. The search, next paragraph, the thirst of the youth of our eternal people will certainly not be quenched by rationalizations and theories that are the product of contemporary mortals, which will share the fate of those ideologies which made their debut only yesterday and which are no more today. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. We read yesterday in the parsha. Here is the place for the law of Moses and Israel, the oral and written law, our independent values dating from the day the Jewish people stood before God, our God at Chorev, and the great voice was heard, which did not stop. I am your God. I am God, your God. You shall have no other gods. Needless to say, I do not speak here of a theoretical and religiosity which serves only as a purely philosophical world outlook, or as the subject of lectures at weekends and holidays. I speak of a pervading and practical way of life, which includes the weekdays too, and all such matters which are usually termed secular. Our faith is, after all, essentially one of practical deeds. So he goes on to beg and plead and prod Ben Gurion to make a difference practically. It is more than likely that the aforementioned lines will astonish you. Do I really imagine by means of this letter I can change your influence and outlook many decades old, and in particular the outlook of a man who has seen the fruits of his labors? But since, in my opinion, the situation in Eretz Yisrael is as described above, the situation in itself, the essential truth of the idea, the unique and most wonderful opportunity granted to you, it is they which speak, appeal, and demand. I'm sure that even without my letter, you have often reflected on this, but I could not allow myself to pass over this in silence at a time when I'm writing to you. And then he continues the letter. It finishes, yours truly, Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And that is the message. What does the Lubavitcher Rebbe say to Ben Gurion? He calls on him to take responsibility and make a difference in those around him. Isn't that exactly what the Rebbe said to Rabbi Sachs? The Rebbe said to Rabbi Sachs, what are you doing to make a difference in the student community in which you live? You chose to be there, so take responsibility for your choice and make a difference in those around you. And that, said Rabbi Sachs, is what has shaped and inspired and informed his entire life trajectory. And that's why when they put together a festschrift, a book in honor of Rabbi Sachs and his teachings and his legacy, what is it called? It's called Radical Responsibility. Because so much of what Rabbi Sachs talks about, teaches about, has inspired us with is all about this point of take responsibility of where we are in our lives and make a difference in the people around you. And all of us can do that. Now I understand, after having read this letter and thinking about this, why it is that when I was in Keren B'Yavneh over 20 years ago, I used to go some Fridays with a group of Talmidim in this Hesder Yeshiva in a blue, antiquated van that had a half cucumber for a gas cap. We used to go to the street in Ashdod, set up a duchen, give out Shabbos candles, and offer to put tefillin on people. This kid from America with his Lubavitch Talmidim in a Hesder Yeshiva was like a comedy routine. Why was I doing that? Because these Bachrim who I met in the yeshiva, they said that we have to take responsibility and make a difference in the people around us. We live in a yeshiva not far from a city in Israel, which has a lot of people. Ashdod was right nearby. Are we taking responsibility to inform and inspire them, to give them an opportunity to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to make a difference in their lives? This is what the Rebbe said to Ben Gurion. And he said, Ben Gurion, you're in a unique position to make a difference. Take responsibility for the influence that you have and exert it positively on the people around you to bring people closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what he said to Rabbi Sachs, and that's what he says to all the shluchim. I have a collection of letters here. I want to share with you 2 letters from the Rebbe. Absolutely fascinating. Fascinating. The first letter is a letter from September, the 21st of September, 1964. People wrote letters from all over the world on all kinds of matters. So somebody wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe about how he should go about his visit to Israel. I don't know how many of us have ever thought before we go to Israel what our spiritual goal of visiting Israel is, which is already a beautiful madrega, right? We go to Israel, first thing we're thinking is, wait a second, does my niece need a new box of Cocoa Puffs? Is she finished with her peanut butter? Right? That's the first shiloh that comes to mind. The second is, well, if I get there in time, how many restaurants can I hit? Or, there's a lot of practical inyanim that go into visiting Israel, but what about the spiritual side? So this guy writes a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe that he's planning a visit to Israel. And there are different ways to visit, and he wants to know from the Rebbe, what should be his orientation? What should be his guide as to thinking about visiting Israel? Interesting. Which by the Rebbe, the Rebbe had a very, very strong connection to Israel, not just this one letter to Ben Gurion. He had a close relationship with Begin and others. Many people came to visit, went to his advice. It's very well known. And of course, there's a very prominent community of Lubavitch Chassidim, Kfar Chabad. I think it's not far from the airport. So the Rebbe writes as part of this letter, he says, look, listen to this letter. Listen to this letter about visiting Israel. He says, nobody lives in a vacuum. In every environment, I'm translating it freely because I have it in the Hebrew, although I think the original letter was in English. In every environment that a person exists, there are interpersonal relationships, there are connections between the person and their environment. In that, a person influences their environment and is influenced by their environment. And therefore, he says, nobody can say that my personal life is my private issue, since my personal life as an individual is part of a social fabric in which I exist. In addition to this, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that when a Jewish tourist comes from America to the Holy Land, people look at that person more than they look at the average Israeli. It raises a measure of curiosity in the local population. People see, an Americai. And therefore, whether the tourist is conscious of it or not, he is influencing and impacting all those with whom he comes in contact. And if you would like me to summarize what I'm trying to say to you in this question, in an answer to your question, my opinion is that you should take the opportunity, lenatzel, cash in, capture this opportunity of visiting Israel to contribute a contribution of the hitkadmut, of the development of the sanctity in the daily life in Israel. Not just, he explains, not just to be a part of it and to receive it, but also and specifically to live as a model for others. Dugma chaya klape acherim. The impact will be much greater. I'm putting this in parentheses, meaning when you go to Israel, don't just daven there and don't just deeply inhale the Kedusha. Have an orientation to make an impact on those people, to inspire them as a Jewish American. Since many times people assume that American Jews are materialistic and we're only interested in the material and we're only, now this is my commentary, we only care about restaurants and how much candy we can buy in the shuk and how many things we're going to amass from a material standpoint. That's what some people think. And rather, our religion, our spirituality, they're secondary and maybe even, God forbid, superficial, the Rebbe writes. And maybe only people who are out of the world of business or involved in everyday affairs, only if you're retired from that, only if you're a rabbi, only those people are spiritual. No, go and show people, Yesh Laharoslam, you should demonstrate. You should demonstrate that an American business person, a balabas, who's young, can also model something else, something different, something aspirational that will inspire people, and to serve as a beacon of light, hashra'ah, even in the land of Israel. What an unbelievable way of thinking about visiting Israel. But the Rebbe says, take responsibility for your choice. Make a difference in those around you. Realize your potential impact. Now I understand. How is it possible that people are traveling around the world, setting up shops in the most far-flung, far-verfene makomas? You know how? Because the Rebbe said that they can realize the influence that they can have. The Rebbe empowered people by telling them, take responsibility for your life and make a difference, because you have to realize that you can. And all of a sudden, somebody goes to Portland, Oregon, and they realize all of a sudden they can have an influence. They go to Kenya, to Tanzania. They go everywhere. And of course, they go to local communities right here in Chicago. Because what the Rebbe said to people was, realize you have more influence than you think. Don't sell yourself short. So the Rebbe was actually building people up. That's what Rabbi Sachs says later in the speech, that what was goinistic about the Rebbe was not that he had followers. The opposite. It's that the Rebbe created leaders. He enabled people to see their potential influence that they can have. Kol echad kafi madrigasam. Every person according to their station, to where they are. So that means men, rabbis, lay people, women, girls. We all have some sphere of influence. Did we ever imagine, did we ever open our imaginations to consider what that would look like? The Rebbe called people to greatness by telling them, take responsibility, not in a way of taking responsibility of putting them down and telling them, you know what it says in the Shulchan Aruch about what you have to do this morning, but telling people, do you realize how much influence you can have? What are the choices that you're making? Unbelievable. So every step of the way, the Rebbe is asking in our ears, in our mind's ear, he's asking us, Sanu, what choice are you making? And with that choice, how are you making a difference? How are you making a difference? How are you a shaliach of Hashem? How are you an emissary of bringing godliness into this world? What are you doing? That's what the Rebbe is asking all the time. He's asking that all the time. Amazing. I think it's amazing. And I think it's so powerful and explains so much. I'll give you one more letter. A guy writes a letter to the Rebbe here in 1969, 30th of July. Lubavitcher boy in Israel is joining the army, which the Rebbe points out in a different letter elsewhere was not uncommon, that the Rebbe supported the Chabad shluchim, the people who went to the tzava, went to the army. So the letter is sent to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe knows the parents of this boy who's going to be mitgayes into the tzava. And first of all, the Rebbe blessed them that he should go b'shalom, come l'shalom, and come back l'shalom. And he hopes that they will be growth-oriented, that everybody will have peace, and his service in the army will bring peace. But then he says, he's discussing here about his role in the army. And the Rebbe says, you probably heard that before the 6-Day War, I encouraged Jews, I spoke about this, I had a campaign. The Rebbe was very into campaigns. The Rebbe says, I had a campaign encouraging men to be makpid, to be more careful about the mitzvah of tefillin. Okay? So now the Rebbe says the following. I have to add something to you. I have to tell you. You should know that when you're wearing tefillin in the army, it's not just because tefillin has a tremendous koach of hatzalah, of protection, that there is an element of pikuach nefashos of being in the army, and that by wearing your tefillin, there's no question that zuchus will help be megan on you to protect you. Oh. But the Rebbe says more than that. For many reasons, you're wearing tefillin in the tzava, it will influence others for good. Kolomar, as if to say, meaning that if you accept upon yourself to be punctilious about wearing your tefillin every day, your impact is going to be doubled. Because not only will you bring an element of zchus for yourself, but many of your friends or peers, they will follow suit. You'll be able to influence. And then the zchus harabim will be more. And then not only that, maybe people will start asking you questions. All kinds of questions, not just questions about tefillin. Because that's what happens when you stand on the street corner and you put tefillin on people. They start asking you things not just about tefillin, about where the Ribono Shalom is, what does it mean to have a meaningful life? How low is the davka? This definitely is specifically part of the youth. People are going to inquisite. They see a guy in their army base who's putting on tefillin, they're secular Jews, they're going to start asking. And that, not only that, maybe some people will mock you, and yet you'll still be steadfast. That will also engender some inquiries. Ulahefach, people will see that you're strong. I'm telling you right now, the Rebbe says, in addition to being able to add to the security of the land and the people of Israel and the otzma of the tzava, by putting on your tefillin, by acting in your personal modeling way, through that of hanachas tefillin among your peers, that will also, Emir Hashem, give you a great zchus. And the Rebbe says it doesn't even matter so much if part of them don't fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin. They haven't ever fulfilled the mitzvah of tefillin. But in some level, by your entering into the tzahal, into the IDF and putting on tefillin, you are making a difference in the lives of those around you. Incredible. So So that's the question we're going to ask ourselves. What's our sphere of influence? What are the choices that we're making in life? How do we take responsibility for those and make a difference in those around him? I saw that Paul put in the chat, is there any indications from Ben-Gurion's memoirs that the letter had an impact? I have no idea. I didn't follow up on that Nakuda. If anybody has some research or some knowledge, please let me know. But I think that this idea that the Rebbe challenged Ben-Gurion with, and he challenged Rabbi Sachs with, is the question that the Rebbe is challenging us with. And each one of us should think about what that means. You know, I saw there was a thing going on in Skokie Shul that somebody is baking challahs or making chicken soup to give to other people during coronavirus, during this period of distance. What an amazing idea. It doesn't take so much to organize that. You know, think about creatively the imagination that we can employ in making a difference in the people around us, especially in this time. That's what this letter is encouraging us. The first part of the letter, the first letter of the Rebbe, that's what you would have expected. But the second part of the letter, that's the chiddush that the Rebbe adds to this conversation, to this whole mahalach hachaim. And look how empowering it was. Look how impactful it was at the world at large. And let's consider how it can be impactful in our lives.